It began on a quiet afternoon, the kind where the world outside the walls of our home felt muted and still. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window, watching the sun dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. My husband, Simon, sat across from me, his eyes fixed on his phone. The silence between us was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional tap of his fingers on the screen. We hadn't spoken much in recent weeks. Our marriage had drifted into a comfortable routine, one that lacked the spark and passion it once had. But it wasn't the kind of comfort that brought peace. It was the kind that came from two people who had long ago stopped trying. We were strangers living in the same house, sharing the same bed, but never truly connecting. I still loved Simon in my own way, but I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. I missed the intimacy, the closeness, but whenever I tried to bridge the gap, it felt like he pulled away even more. He had his own ways of finding excitement, of course, his hobbies, his friends, his long nights out. And now, as I was about to find out, he had another idea in mind. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I glanced up, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like days. "There's something I want to talk to you about," he said, his voice low, as if he was weighing his words carefully. I nodded, unsure of what was coming. My mind raced with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. "I've been thinking about trying something new, something that might help us connect again." He paused, watching me closely for a reaction. I could feel the pit of anxiety forming in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Simon set his phone down, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I know things between us haven't been great. And I know you've noticed it too. So I was thinking, maybe we could spice things up." I blinked, confused. "Spice things up? How?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking away from mine for just a moment before returning, filled with a mixture of anticipation and hesitation. "I was thinking about inviting someone else in. Or maybe 2 people. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was suggesting. "Are you serious?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. He nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. We've been stuck in this rut for so long, and I think this could be something new, something exciting for both of us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband was sitting there, calmly suggesting that we invite 2 strangers into our marriage, into our most intimate moments, as if that would somehow fix the cracks that had formed between us. "Who are these people?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're just 2 guys I know from the gym," he said almost too casually. "I've talked to them a bit, and they're open to it." I felt a cold rush of disbelief wash over me. He had already talked to them? Planned this? My head was spinning. "Simon, I don't know." I started, but he cut me off. "Look, I know it's a lot to take in. But just think about it, okay? It could be good for us. It could be fun." Fun. That was what this was about to him. Just a way to shake things up, to inject some excitement into his life. But what about me? What about the way this made me feel? The betrayal, the confusion, the doubt? Still, there was a part of me, deep down, hidden beneath all the fear and uncertainty, that was curious. I had felt invisible for so long, forgotten in my own marriage. And now, Simon was offering me something I hadn't even realized I wanted: attention, desire, the chance to feel alive again. But at what cost? I looked at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Was this really about us, or was it just about him? "Let me think about it," I said quietly, my heart pounding in my chest. Simon nodded, clearly relieved that I hadn't outright rejected the idea. "That's all I'm asking," he said softly. "Just think about it." And so I did. For days, the idea swirled around in my mind, never leaving me alone. I thought about what it would mean for our marriage, for me. Could I really go through with it? Could I let myself be part of something so wild? Then one evening, after a long and restless night of tossing and turning, I made my decision. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. In fact, I wrestled with it for days. But the more I thought about it, the more I found myself unable to ignore the quiet, persistent voice in the back of my mind. That voice whispered to me at night, when Simon lay beside me, snoring softly while I stared at the ceiling, my heart racing. It reminded me of all the things I hadn't felt in years: desire, passion, the heat of someone's touch, the thrill of being wanted. So when I told Simon I would go along with it, I did so with a mixture of trepidation and strange, reluctant excitement. We didn't talk about it much after that. Simon seemed content with my decision, though I noticed he didn't press me for more details. He left me to process it on my own, which only made the tension between us more palpable. There was something about the way he watched me now, curious, expectant, as if he was waiting for the moment everything would fall into place. And then one evening it did. It was late afternoon when Simon told me that the two young men would be coming over that night. He said it as casually as if he were reminding me to pick up milk from the store. I remember standing there, frozen in the kitchen, my hands still wet from washing the dishes, when the reality of what was about to happen hit me. "Are you ready for this?" Simon asked, his voice low, his gaze fixed on me. There was an eagerness in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. He seemed excited, almost impatient. "I don't know," I replied honestly, my stomach twisting into knots. "It'll be fine," he said, stepping closer and placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt foreign, almost clinical. "You'll see. Just relax, okay?" I nodded, but the truth was, I didn't feel relaxed at all. As the sun set and the house grew darker, my anxiety only deepened. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the mundane, folding laundry, tidying up the living room, but nothing could shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen, something that would change everything. By the time the doorbell rang, I was a bundle of nerves. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening as Simon greeted the two men, their voices drifting up from the entryway. They were young, younger than I'd imagined. I hadn't asked Simon for details, but now that they were here, I felt a sense of dread creeping over me. I heard their footsteps as they followed Simon into the garage, where he had set up everything for the evening. The garage had always been Simon's domain, a space cluttered with tools and half-finished projects. But now, it felt like something else entirely, a place where the boundaries of our marriage were about to be tested. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk downstairs, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the garage door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. I could hear their voices inside, low and muffled, as if they were waiting for me. I opened the door. The scene that greeted me was surreal. Simon stood near the back wall, leaning casually against a workbench, his arms crossed over his chest. The two young men, Nick and Jason, as Simon introduced them, stood by the center of the room, looking up at me with polite, if slightly nervous, smiles. Nick was tall, with dark hair that fell just over his eyes, giving him a boyish charm. Jason was shorter, more solidly built, with a confident posture that belied the uncertainty in his eyes. They were both attractive in that effortless way that young men often are, and I felt my heart race as their gazes flicked over me, assessing, curious. "Come in," Simon said, his voice unusually warm, as if trying to put me at ease. But the tension in the room was undeniable. I could feel it, thick and heavy, as I stepped further into the garage, my eyes darting between the three of them. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence stretched out, taut and uncomfortable, until finally, Nick broke it with a quiet, nervous chuckle. "So, this is new," he said, glancing at Jason for reassurance. Jason nodded, but his smile was tight, almost forced. "Yeah, definitely new." I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say or do. I could feel Simon's eyes on me, watching closely, waiting for my next move. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Simon pushed off the workbench and crossed the room, stopping just in front of me. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm but not harsh. "You can," he said softly. "Trust me, it'll be okay." But could I trust him? Could I really go through with this? The doubt swirled in my mind, but beneath it, there was something else, something darker, something that stirred in my chest as Nick and Jason exchanged another glance. Before I could second-guess myself, Simon leaned in and kissed me, softly at first, then more insistently. I hesitated, unsure, but when his hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, I found myself kissing him back. It was strange, the familiarity of Simon's touch mixed with the unfamiliar thrill of knowing that we weren't alone. I could feel Nick and Jason watching, their presence adding a layer of tension I hadn't anticipated. Simon pulled away, his lips brushing against my ear. "You can do this," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "Just let go." And so I did. As Simon stepped back, I felt the weight of the moment settle on me, thick and suffocating. My heart raced, my breath quick and shallow, but I nodded, more to myself than to him. I took another step into the garage, now acutely aware of the two men standing only a few feet away. Their eyes were fixed on me, and I could sense their anticipation, their own mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Nick shifted slightly, rubbing the back of his neck, while Jason stood still, his gaze steady. I could see them trying to appear calm, but there was something else, an electric tension in the air that made my skin prickle. It wasn't just them, though. I felt it too, a strange, forbidden excitement bubbling just beneath the surface. Simon's voice broke the silence again, smooth and controlled. "Why don't we all just take it slow?" His words lingered, but the room remained still, as if no one was quite sure what to do next. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of doubt, guilt, and, surprisingly, curiosity. Part of me wanted to run, to stop everything before it went too far. But another part, a deeper, hidden part, wanted to see where this would go. The tension between us was undeniable, and I wasn't sure I could turn back now. Nick took a cautious step forward, his eyes meeting mine. "Are you okay with this?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to me, and the sincerity in his question caught me off guard. I swallowed, nodding slowly. "I think so," I whispered, though the words felt shaky on my lips. Jason stepped forward too, his movements more assured. "We don't want to make you uncomfortable," he added, his gaze gentle but direct. His presence felt different from Nick's, more confident, more certain. It was as if he was ready for whatever came next, but still, he was waiting for my signal. Simon watched the exchange closely, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, though, something that told me this was as much for him as it was for me. Maybe more. He stood there, arms crossed, waiting, watching. Without another word, Nick reached out and took my hand, his touch light but deliberate. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a jolt of awareness through me, and suddenly, everything felt more real. His fingers curled gently around mine, and I could feel the subtle tremor in his grip, as if he wasn't entirely sure either. But when his other hand slid to my waist, resting just above my hip, I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him guide me a little closer, his eyes locked on mine, searching for any sign of hesitation. There was an intensity in his gaze now, something raw and vulnerable that made my heart pound even harder. Jason stepped in behind me, his presence solid and grounding. I felt his hands brush against my shoulders, tentative at first, but as I leaned back slightly into him, they became more confident. His touch was firm but gentle, tracing a line down my arms before resting on my waist, just below where Nick's hand lingered. The world outside the garage seemed to blur and fade, leaving only the three of us in this small, intimate space. My breath came in shallow bursts, my heart racing as I felt the warmth of their bodies so close to mine. Simon was still watching, silent, but I could feel his approval in the air, almost palpable. Nick leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from mine. His breath was warm, and I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. He hesitated, waiting for a sign, for permission. I didn't know what to say, so I simply closed the distance, brushing my lips against his in a tentative kiss. It was soft, almost shy at first, but the spark between us was undeniable. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as his hand tightened slightly on my waist, pulling me closer. Behind me, Jason's hand slid up to my shoulders, steadying me as I kissed Nick, his presence grounding but electric in its own way. My mind raced, filled with conflicting thoughts and emotions. I knew this was wrong, knew that it crossed a line I never thought I'd approach. But at the same time, there was a thrill in it, something exciting, forbidden, and impossible to ignore. The boundaries of my marriage felt distant, blurred by the intensity of the moment. Jason's lips found the side of my neck, pressing soft, deliberate kisses along my skin. I shivered at the touch, my body responding in ways I hadn't anticipated. The heat between us grew, the tension thickening with every moment that passed. Nick's kiss became more urgent, more demanding, and I found myself leaning into it, lost in the sensation. I could feel Jason's hand slide lower, tracing the curve of my waist, his breath hot against my skin as he whispered something I couldn't quite hear. His touch was firm, confident, and I felt my body reacting, my pulse racing, as the room seemed to shrink around us. Nick pulled back for just a moment, his eyes dark with desire as he looked at me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. I hesitated, but only for a moment. The doubt that had been clawing at me felt distant now, overshadowed by the rush of adrenaline and the intensity of the moment. I nodded, barely able to find my voice. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely audible, but it was all he needed. Jason's hands tightened on my waist, pulling me back against him as Nick leaned in again, capturing my lips in another kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. I gave in to the moment, to the tension that had been building for so long, and let myself be swept away. Behind me, I could hear Simon's soft, approving sigh, his eyes still fixed on us, watching everything unfold. He had wanted this, for me, for him, for us. And now there was no turning back. The tension between us was palpable, the air thick with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. My body moved instinctively now, responding to the touch of both men, as if I had been waiting for this moment, without even realizing it. Nick's kisses grew more insistent, his hands exploring my body with a hunger that sent waves of heat through me. Jason's presence behind me was just as powerful, his lips grazing my neck as his hands traced the curves of my waist, pulling me even closer. I had never imagined myself in a situation like this, caught between two younger men, with my husband standing silently, watching from the sidelines. It should have felt wrong, should have been too much, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing I could do. I was lost in the moment, in the heat, in the feeling of being wanted again. Jason's hand slid lower, resting on my hips as he pressed his body against mine. His breath was hot against my ear, sending shivers down my spine. I could feel the firmness of his grip, the strength of his hold, and it made my pulse race even faster. Nick's hands were on me too, exploring with a confidence that made my skin tingle. His lips were everywhere, my mouth, my neck, my collarbone, and I could barely keep up with the sensations overwhelming me. I let out a soft gasp, leaning into Jason's touch, while Nick's hands roamed over me with a mixture of gentleness and urgency. Every part of me felt alive, buzzing with the tension of the moment, the forbidden thrill of what we were doing. My mind raced, caught somewhere between guilt and desire, but my body was firmly in control, responding to their every move. Behind me, Jason whispered something again, his voice low and husky, though I couldn't quite make out the words. It didn't matter. His hands, his touch, spoke louder than anything he could say. He wanted me, and I could feel it in every part of me. Nick's lips trailed down my neck, leaving a path of warmth in their wake, his breath hot against my skin. I closed my eyes, letting myself surrender to the sensations, to the moment, to the feeling of being completely desired, completely consumed. Time seemed to blur around us, the world outside the garage fading away. There was only us now, me, Nick, Jason, and Simon, watching silently from the edge of the room. At some point, I glanced back at Simon, searching for something in his expression, approval, concern, anything that would ground me in the reality of what was happening. His gaze met mine, steady and calm, his face unreadable. But there was no anger, no hesitation. He wanted this. He had orchestrated this. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just for me. It was for him too. He was living through this, experiencing it in his own way, even if he wasn't physically involved. I turned back to Nick and Jason, my heart pounding in my chest as the tension between us reached a boiling point. Their hands were on me, their bodies pressed close, and I could feel the weight of the moment building to something inevitable. There was no turning back now, no undoing what had been set into motion. Nick's lips found mine again, and this time, the kiss was urgent, filled with an intensity that took my breath away. His hands tightened on my waist, pulling me closer, while Jason's grip on my hips steadied me. I felt trapped between them, and yet, somehow, I had never felt more free. The moment built and built, the tension between us growing until it felt like it would snap. And then suddenly it did. I let out a soft moan, my body trembling as everything we had been building toward came crashing down around us. It was overwhelming. Too much and yet not enough. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I leaned into Nick, feeling Jason's strong grip behind me, holding me steady. For a moment, I was lost, completely consumed by the intensity of it all. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The room was filled with the sound of our heavy breathing, the tension still lingering in the air but slowly dissipating. I pulled away from Nick, my legs unsteady, my mind still reeling from the intensity of the encounter. Jason released his hold on me, stepping back, and I turned to face Simon. He hadn't moved. He stood there, still watching, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression calm and unreadable. I waited for him to say something, to acknowledge what had just happened, but he remained silent. I looked between the three of them, Nick, Jason, and Simon, unsure of what to do next. The moment felt surreal, like I had crossed some invisible line that I couldn't uncross, and now I was standing on the other side, unsure of where to go from here. I think that's enough, I said softly, my voice trembling slightly as I took a step back. The room felt too small, too close, and I needed to get out, to breathe. Nick and Jason exchanged a glance, their own expressions a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. They hadn't expected this either, and now, like me, they were unsure of what came next. Simon finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "You did well," he said simply, his gaze locked on me. There was something in his tone that I couldn't quite place. Pride, perhaps, or maybe relief. Either way, it wasn't the reaction I had been expecting. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and turned toward the door. My legs felt weak, my body heavy with the weight of what had just happened. I needed space, time to think, time to process everything. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt a wave of emotions wash over me, guilt, confusion, desire, all tangled together in a knot that I couldn't untangle. I didn't know what this meant for my marriage, for my relationship with Simon, or even for myself. All I knew was that something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, I wasn't sure. Not yet. But one thing was certain. Life would never be the same again.